A white passenger attacked a black teen over a seat dispute, but the teen's father had a hidden camera and a legal team ready to expose the truth. A white passenger stabbed a black teen during a recliner dispute. Thinking the chaos would hide his crime, he didn't realize the boy's father had a hidden camera recording every second and a legal team that could bury an entire airline. The moment that blade hit, the case was already won. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when real power steps forward. Kalen Merrick flinched slightly as the seatback jolted forward with a sudden, aggressive shove. The motion wasn't caused by turbulence. It came from the man seated behind him, Preston Harlon, a thick-necked executive whose flushed cheeks and bulging veins suggested he'd spent most of his life getting his way. Kalen had only mildly reclined his seat, not far, just enough to relieve the stiffness in his back as NovaSky Flight 772 leveled off at cruising altitude. He'd been reading a digital physics manual, a chapter on gravitational wave mechanics, when the push broke his focus. He turned, polite but cautious. "Sorry, sir," Kalen said, offering a gentle nod. "If it's uncomfortable, I can adjust it forward." "It's fine," Preston muttered through gritted teeth, not meeting Kalen's eyes, but his tone was soaked in disdain, like acid barely contained behind words. Kalen paused, unsure whether to take the offer back. His father, Dr. Dorian Merrick, sat across the aisle in 14C. Tall, composed, and unreadable behind round spectacles, Dorian hadn't missed a single detail. His gaze tracked every nuance of the exchange. Preston's refusal to make eye contact, the slight twitch of his jaw, the sharpness in his breath. Years of courtroom work had taught Dorian to detect escalation before it announced itself. Kalen slowly turned back to his screen. The digital pages of his manual flipped quietly, but his shoulders remained tense. He could still feel Preston's stare drilling into the back of his head like a silent verdict. Dorian's hand rested calmly on the armrest, but his other hand hovered near his cuff, more habit than impulse. Minutes passed. The whir of the engine blended with the subtle shuffle of feet and the crinkle of snack wrappers. The intercom buzzed once, then fell quiet. Most passengers had settled into the lull of mid-flight calm, but not Preston. Suddenly, without any words this time, he lunged forward and jabbed something into the side of Kalen's shoulder. It was small, a folded pen, but it was firm and deliberate. Kalen gasped, more in shock than pain. The jab hadn't broken skin, but it wasn't accidental. He turned again, mouth slightly open, blinking in disbelief. "Kids like you don't respect space," Preston hissed low, eyes gleaming with something colder than irritation. His breath smelled faintly of mint and something bitter, bourbon, maybe. Across the aisle, Dorian stood. There was no rush in his movement, no drama, just a quiet precision that made the nearby passengers turn their heads. His voice, when it came, was low but unshakable. "Is there a problem with how my son is seated?" Preston leaned back slowly, arms folded. "Yeah, your son's a problem." Dorian's face didn't move. His eyes did not blink, but his left hand moved down his coat, an elegant navy blazer tailored to blend into first class but built with function, and tapped twice on a small black button stitched into the cuff. A soft vibration confirmed what he knew. Recording activated. Torin Vale, the flight attendant, appeared then. He was in his early 30s, with an athletic build and a trained smile that now faltered. He had witnessed the jab. Kalen had seen him glance over. The other passengers nearby had, too. But Torin said nothing of the incident. Instead, he walked up to Dorian and gestured politely but firmly. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat." Dorian turned to Vale, gaze unblinking. "Are you not going to address what just happened?" Vale's jaw shifted. "Please return to your seat, sir." No eye contact, no acknowledgement. The man behind the badge and wings had chosen not to see. Kalen's heart thudded unevenly. He felt exposed, not just from the jab or Preston's whisper, but from something heavier, something unjust and hard to name. a growing understanding that the person assigned to help might be more interested in peace than truth. His father's silence now carried weight, not resignation. Dorian's expression was unreadable, but he gave a faint nod and stepped back across the aisle. He sat down with deliberate care. His fingers brushed once more against the stitched button in his sleeve. Kalen didn't speak. Neither did Preston, but the tension between the rows thickened, quiet as cloud cover, but twice as suffocating. In the rows behind them, a few passengers exchanged glances. A businessman in 16B leaned forward ever so slightly, angling his phone just beneath his tray table. Another man on the opposite side subtly pressed the volume button on his earbuds, muting his podcast to listen more carefully. Torrin Vale returned to the galley, pretending to adjust a beverage cart, though his eyes lingered back toward row 14 like a man trying to avoid a mess he'd already stepped in. The hum of the engines offered no relief. The cabin lights dimmed slightly for passenger comfort, but the psychological temperature in that corner of the plane had already shifted. In seat 14A, Kalen clenched his jaw. His hands rested on the tablet, but his eyes were no longer reading. He was waiting, tense, uncertain, but also learning. This wasn't just a bad flight anymore. This was something his father had warned him about. When people decide you're the problem, even your silence becomes an accusation. And in that moment, Dorian Merrick, civil rights attorney and former pilot, sat with the weight of history pressing into the fibers of his seat. The flight continued like nothing had happened, but everything had. He tapped twice on the black button stitched into his blazer cuff. Recording activated. Preston Harlon's foot struck the base of Kalen Merrick's seat again, harder this time. It wasn't an accident. The teen's spine rattled with each calculated jolt, and the quiet murmur of passengers blurred beneath the drone of the engines. Kalen stiffened, trying to keep his focus on the physics manual glowing faintly on his tablet. He adjusted his position slightly, hoping it would lessen the tension, but it didn't matter. The next kick came sharper. Then the tension snapped. With a sudden, violent motion, Preston leaned forward, his thick hand grabbing the top of Kalen's seat and yanking hard. The seat barely moved, held firm by Kalen's weight, but the force startled him. His tablet slid against the tray. "Hey," Kalen began, not in anger, just confusion. Preston's face twisted, flushed with rage and something else, something rehearsed. His other hand dove into his coat pocket. What emerged was a flash of silver, too fast for most eyes to track. A small, polished pocket knife flicked open with a mechanical snap. Before anyone could speak, Preston thrust the blade forward, plunging it into Kalen's side just beneath the rib cage. Kalen gasped. The air around him collapsed into silence as a sharp cry escaped his lips. His body jerked. Pain, white-hot and surreal, shot through his ribs as he instinctively clutched the spot where the blade had struck. Blood soaked the hem of his shirt in seconds. Passengers in nearby rows screamed, hands flying to mouths, phones raised in disbelief. The metallic scent of blood mingled with the pressurized cabin air. Dorian Merrick, seated just across the aisle, reacted instantly. His body propelled forward, voice cutting through the rising chaos. "Hey, put that down!" His words were a command, not a plea. Years of courtroom precision sharpened every syllable. His gaze locked on the glinting knife and then on his son, curled over in pain. Flight attendant Torrin Vale turned, startled by the outburst, but his voice added confusion rather than clarity. "Sir, sit down," he barked, though his eyes darted uncertainly between Dorian and Preston. His voice cracked slightly, authority without direction. Preston, realizing the storm he had just ignited, fumbled. The knife disappeared back into his coat as quickly as it had emerged. "He attacked me first," he shouted, standing partway and gesturing with exaggerated panic. The lie spilled from his mouth without effort. Kalen could barely hear it. He was breathing shallow now, his mind trying to push through the pain. Blood continued to seep through his fingers. "Move," Dorian growled, brushing past the food cart and lunging across the aisle. He dropped to one knee, his arm sliding protectively across Kalen's chest. "I'm here. I've got you," he said, voice low and steady, the same tone he'd used during emergency drills in his piloting days. But this wasn't a simulation. This was real. A few rows back, a passenger had already hit record. The phone captured it all: the glint of the blade, the wound, the attack, the scramble. Others followed suit, their phones rising like a digital chorus of accountability. Vale reached for the intercom. "Security assistance to cabin. Immediate," he began, then faltered. There was no air marshal aboard. This was a mid-tier domestic route. His call was theater. "Lock the cabin," someone shouted from the back. The panic grew. Passengers stood half out of their seats, torn between helping and staying safe. Preston glanced at the crowd and realized he'd lost control of the story. The sympathy he might have manufactured with a well-timed complaint was gone. Now he was the man with the knife, the stabber. "I said, he hit me first," Preston barked again, voice rising. Dorian didn't even look at him. He was focused entirely on his son, his hands pressed firmly over the wound, his breaths matching Kalen's, guiding him through the pain. He reached subtly for the inside of his blazer cuff and tapped twice. The stitching lit faintly for a moment. Recording activated. Then he looked up. "I have the footage," Dorian said coldly, his voice echoing across the row. "Every second of it." The pilots were alerted. The intercom crackled with a tight, clipped voice. "This is your captain speaking. We are initiating an emergency diversion to Halvin Ridge Regional Airfield. Remain calm and follow crew instructions." The calm tone did little to ease the sudden spike in cabin tension. Gasps and murmurs erupted like the rustle of dry leaves in wind. Passengers twisted in their seats, necks craning for any glimpse of what had triggered the diversion. The word "stabbed," whispered between aisles, passed like static electricity. Kalen Merrick sat hunched in 14A, his hand clutching the fabric near his side where Preston Harlon had jabbed him with a pocket knife. Blood soaked through the edge of his shirt, slowly darkening the cotton with each shallow breath. His father, Dr. Dorian Merrick, knelt beside him, one hand pressed against the wound with a folded white handkerchief, the other resting firmly on Kalen's trembling shoulder. "You're going to be okay," Dorian whispered, his voice calm but steel-wrapped. "Just breathe. We've been through worse turbulence than this." The metaphor wasn't just for comfort, it was a coded signal. Stay grounded. Stay sharp. We're still flying. Torrin Vale, the flight attendant, stood near row 12, his arms raised like a mall security guard trying to look official. "Everyone, please remain seated. The situation is being handled. This is a safety precaution." His voice trembled, not from concern for the boy, but from the loss of control. He repeated the line, "We're handling it," as if saying it enough would make it true. Preston Harlon, now slouched in 15A with his coat crumpled in his lap, looked pale. His forehead glistened with sweat, and his hands twitched like startled birds. Yet he was not restrained. Vale had insisted moments earlier, in a strained exchange with Dorian, that without federal authorization, restraint wasn't permitted. Dorian hadn't argued. He'd simply pressed the side of his cuff once. A soft click confirmed the transmission. Secure upload initiated. The footage stitched together seamlessly. Preston's muttered slurs, the sudden assault, the look of detached amusement on Vale's face when Kalen cried out. It was being transmitted live to Dorian's firm, where auto-triage systems began sorting, time-stamping, and securing it under legal review. Another layer backed it up to a private cloud, ensuring redundancy. Experience had taught Dorian not to trust a single angle. His custom-built seat cam, tucked inside the recline latch, captured it all. Farther down the cabin, a man seated alone in 21C stirred. Heron Voss was not listed as a marshal, nor wearing any insignia. Yet there was something unmistakable about him. precise, deliberate. He had watched the entire sequence unfold without flinching, his gaze like a security scan that registered threats before they formed. He tapped his watch 3 times. A soft vibration pulsed on his wrist. Leaning forward, he whispered, "Confirm location. On board, Flight 772. Civil escalation. Contact field, Judge Marin." The device chirped in confirmation. He rose, slow and steady like a diver surfacing from deep water. His steps made no sound over the low drone of the aircraft, but heads turned as he advanced toward row 14. He moved past the galley, past Torrin Vale, who turned, startled. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to—" "I'm not here for snacks," Harron said flatly, flashing a card the color of tarnished silver. It bore an insignia of the Inter-Carrier Tribunal Authority, marked with civil escalation clearance. "I'm Liaison Harron Voss. I need to see that man's hands." The cabin froze. Every eye landed on Preston. He fumbled to raise them as if unaware of what he held only moments before. "What is this?" he muttered. "Who are you?" "Sir," Harron repeated with the same unshaken tone, "I need to see your hands." Harron Voss did not hesitate. He stepped forward from row 17 like a man walking into a storm he'd memorized years ago. His presence was calm, but his movements were deliberate, practiced, like someone who had been waiting for the exact moment the cabin's moral center would collapse. He raised a worn black wallet holding an identification badge with a silver insignia and a holographic stamp. His voice, though measured, cut through the pressurized air like a switchblade. "My name is Harron Voss, Compliance Tribunal Liaison, Division 4. I'm requesting immediate detainment of passenger Preston Harlon under Civil Flight Code S14 for in-flight aggravated assault." The entire row went silent. Torrin Vale blinked twice and shifted uncomfortably in his shoes. "Sir," he began, voice brittle, "we have protocol here. You're not authorized to—" "You already violated protocol," Harron interrupted, eyes sharp. "The moment you failed to intervene after a weapon was drawn, you forfeited procedural shelter. This is no longer airline jurisdiction. This is federal." Preston, still seated but visibly agitated, laughed nervously. "You've got to be kidding me. I barely scratched him." "Sir," Harron barked, pivoting toward Preston, "do not speak. Place your hands where I can see them." Across the aisle, Dorian Merrick continued pressing a blood-soaked cloth against his son's ribs. He didn't look up. His hand stayed steady. Kalen's face was pale, but he nodded faintly, trusting the order returning to the chaos. Vale glanced around, searching for support that wasn't there. Passengers now stared at him as though he were the one holding the knife. His voice dropped into a whisper. "We do have an emergency restraint kit in the rear wall storage, but we're not cleared." "You are now," Harron said coldly. "Retrieve it, or I will." Still, Vale didn't move. That's when Laris Dorn, the retired engineer in 12F, slowly stood. He raised one hand toward the ceiling for attention, then pointed at Harron's badge. "I know that symbol. Tribunal Liaison. Confirmed. You stall another second, and you'll be charged with obstruction under S19B." The balance broke. Vale hesitated only a moment longer before walking stiffly toward the cabin wall. He opened the compartment and pulled out the restraint band, a soft, layered cuff with adjustable Velcro and internal compliance thread designed to restrict motion without harming the detained. "I'll do it," Vale muttered, offering it. "No," Harron said, stepping forward. "You've already demonstrated bias. You'll stand back." Preston rose slightly in protest, but before he could take a full breath to argue, Harron moved. A precise pivot of the foot, a tilt of the shoulder, and he dropped Preston sideways into the aisle with minimal force but maximum impact. The man let out a muffled grunt as Harron knelt, pinning him down and looping the restraint smoothly behind his wrists, securing it against the armrest support. "You're not a victim here," Harron said under his breath. "You're a lesson waiting to be written." Passengers erupted in quiet applause, not loud, not celebratory, but grateful. A few even began recording again, capturing what accountability looked like mid-air. Torrin Vale remained near the galley, stunned and silent, his authority evaporated. The pilot's voice crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our emergency descent into Halvan Ridge Regional. Cabin crew, prepare for landing procedures." Harron stood and adjusted his blazer, eyes scanning the seated passengers. "We'll be on the ground shortly," he said firmly. "Tribunal officers will meet us on the tarmac. If you witness the incident, prepare to give statements. Every voice matters now." The wheels slammed against the tarmac with a jolt that shook every overhead bin. Oxygen masks rattled in their compartments as the fuselage trembled from the sudden deceleration. Screeching rubber dragged across the runway at Halvan Ridge Regional Airfield, the plane skidding slightly before stabilizing into a fast taxi. Within seconds, the aisle lights flickered to emergency white. Passengers, still stunned from the mid-air chaos, craned their necks toward the windows. Emergency vehicles, flashing amber and red, were already in position beside the strip. A rapid succession of clicks came from the forward cabin door as the jet bridge extended and latched. Before the door even fully opened, 2 officers from the Halvan Ridge Tribunal Division boarded, one tall and lean, the other shorter with a broad chest and quick eyes. They didn't need to ask questions. They walked directly toward Preston Harlon, still cuffed by the emergency restraint band installed by Harron Voss. Preston shrank back in his seat, trying to shield his face, but the camera flashes from waiting reporters outside were already strobing through the windows like a public verdict. The officers lifted him without a word, their grips professional and cold. Preston didn't struggle, but his face, once red with entitlement, was now bloodless with shame. 2 paramedics followed. One of them carried a small field stretcher while the other scanned the cabin with urgency. "Where's the teen?" the taller medic asked. "Here," Dorian Merrick said, rising slowly from seat 14C, his arm steady around his son's shoulder. Kalen, pale but conscious, was wincing with each breath. A white compression wrap circled his ribs where the knife had punctured skin. Blood had been cleaned, but the stain on his shirt told the full story. The medics guided him gently onto the stretcher. As they rolled him down the aisle, some passengers leaned away in respectful silence, while others nodded at Dorian, silent acknowledgments of courage and injustice witnessed. Dorian walked beside the stretcher, posture erect, every stride balanced between composure and fury. He didn't glance at Preston. He didn't need to. Just behind them, trying to melt into the retreating line of cabin crew, Torrin Vale adjusted his tie and moved with a slouching haste. But at the aircraft door, Officer Merrick Tarn stood waiting. He held a gray folder labeled Flight 772, Stream Capture Log. His expression was impassive as he stepped forward, blocking Vale's exit. "Crew member Torrin Vale," Tarn said flatly. "You'll be coming with us, too." Vale blinked. "I didn't do anything. The captain was in charge." Tarn opened the folder just enough for Vale to see the screenshots. One showed Preston standing, arm raised, silver blade in hand. Another showed Vale smirking beside him minutes earlier. "Let's go," Tarn said. The air around them crackled with unspoken consequences. Inside the terminal, the chaos of the emergency landing met the cold precision of legal structure. Dorian's legal team was already waiting. Suits opened briefcases as tablets powered up. Footage streamed from secure devices, synced from Dorian's hidden cuff camera and the seat-mounted cam he'd installed before boarding. Affidavit forms were prepared. A restraining order had already been filed. A digital clock above the terminal gates read 10:43 p.m., but the team worked as if it were midday trial prep. Across the terminal, Tribune Judge Kyron Voss, taller, older, and sterner than his younger brother Harron, strode in with a file under his arm and a calm that unnerved even the most seasoned staff. He shook Dorian's hand firmly. "We've been needing a case like this to set precedent," he said, his eyes scanning the open files. "This is the one." A hearing was scheduled for the next day. A tribunal chamber was prepared within hours, shielded from media but equipped with full transparency tools, witness cams, timestamp overlay screens, and a real-time evidence submission console. By the early hours of morning, NovaSky's lawyers began to make their move. Preston's defense team filed an immediate motion for leniency. Their angle? That Preston acted in self-defense. They claimed aggressive seat behavior, invasion of personal space, and intimidation by physical presence. Dorian sat silently in the prep room as the words were read aloud. Across from him, Kalen rested, IV tube in one arm, tablet in the other. "They're blaming you for existing," Dorian said quietly, "but the footage doesn't lie." And it didn't. The tribunal chamber later watched as synced footage played out. Preston's muttered slurs, the violent shove, the knife, the frozen inaction from Vale. Every second was accounted for, time-stamped, layered with data points. The images shattered every excuse. In the press pen outside the chamber, journalists jotted notes feverishly. One line from Judge Voss caught every ear. "This will be a turning point, not just for this flight, but for who gets to rewrite the story at 30,000 feet. The tribunal chamber was full before the hour struck 9. Legal aides shuffled papers, reporters whispered from the back row, and a faint hum of fluorescent lights underscored the pressure rising in the room. At the front, a wide projection screen displayed the seal of the Halvin Ridge Regional Tribunal. No one needed to be reminded why they were there. The stabbing on NovaSky Flight 772 had dominated headlines all night. Now, the people responsible were being brought forward, under oath. Kalen Merrick sat beside his lead counsel, his posture straight but not stiff. His son, Kalen, was still recovering off-site, but his voice would be heard through documented footage and affidavits. Dorian's hands remained folded over a thin file containing synchronized timestamp data, footage from his blazer cuff, the internal cabin stream, and a bystander's phone. None of it had been edited. None of it could be. Judge Kieran Voss entered without ceremony, a tall man with graying temples and unreadable eyes. He took his seat and signaled to begin. Case 772C, Passenger Assault and Crew Negligence, Opening Review. His voice echoed through the chamber like a gavel already falling. On the left, Preston Harlon sat with a freshly trimmed beard and a tailored suit that failed to mask the unease beneath. His attorneys leaned close, whispering strategy. One of them rose. "Your Honor, we'd like to submit a plea of temporary emotional duress on behalf of Mr. Harlon. The events were unfortunate but triggered by unexpected anxiety." The room didn't react, but the silence was thicker than any protest. Dorian's counsel stood. "Respectfully, Your Honor, the defense had every opportunity to submit this prior. The footage from the incident has been authenticated and reviewed. We request immediate playback." Voss gave a single nod. "Play it." The lights dimmed. On the screen, the interior of Flight 772 flickered to life. Preston's face appeared first, leaning forward, hissing at a teenager. The blade flashed once, then disappeared. Gasps sounded from the gallery. The slow-motion sequence captured everything. Preston's face twisting in disdain, the exact moment the pen jab turned into a stab, and, crucially, the indifferent glance of flight attendant Torrin Vale, who stood nearby doing nothing. When the footage paused, Voss turned his gaze to Vale, seated on the witness bench. "Mr. Vale, why did you fail to intervene when a weapon was visibly used on a minor?" Vale swallowed hard. I didn't think it was real." Dorian leaned forward slightly. His jaw didn't clench, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Voss gestured to the technician. "Resume footage. Quarter speed." The video resumed. Vale was shown again, just moments before the incident, smirking at one of Preston's comments. The words were faint, but transcribable. "These kids don't know how to act," Preston had said. Vale's mouth curled upward in response. A beat of silence fell over the tribunal. "You found that funny?" Voss asked, his tone flat but pointed. Vale shifted in his seat. "I wasn't endorsing it. It was tense. I was trying to de-escalate." "And did you?" Vale had no answer. He looked down at his hands. Voss leaned forward, his voice lowering but cutting sharper than any shout. "This isn't just negligence. This is silent permission." Dorian felt the weight of those words press into the room like gravity. He glanced at the audience seats and spotted a familiar face. Aaron Voss, the off-duty tribunal liaison who had intervened on the flight, now seated quietly, observing his older brother dispense justice. The irony didn't escape Dorian. Two brothers, one enforcing order in the sky, the other restoring it on the ground. The defense attempted to pivot. Mr. Vale was under immense pressure. There was no official air marshal on board. He lacked training for real-time threat situations. But the footage contradicted that argument. More frames rolled, including Vale's refusal to produce restraints until pressured by multiple passengers. The legal team pulled up crew training logs. Vale had completed the threat containment module 2 years prior with full certification. Voss raised his hand. Enough. The word struck like a hammer. Preston sat stiffly. Vale looked increasingly pale. Then came the most devastating evidence of the morning. A time-stamped sequence from the internal camera archive that revealed Vale had been watching the row where Kalen sat. Not distracted, not overwhelmed. Watching, doing nothing. Voss turned his chair slightly toward the gallery and addressed the court, not just the defendants. "We are not just here to try a stabbing. We are here to decide what it means when someone in uniform decides not to act." He let the words settle. From the back, Dorian could feel the tide changing. The courtroom wasn't just listening anymore, it was aligning. The technician dimmed the screen. Voss looked to the prosecution table. "Mr. Merrick, your team has submitted additional complaints that may redefine the case. We will address those separately. For now, this tribunal acknowledges the evidence of assault and negligence with preliminary validity. We will reconvene at 3 p.m. to deliberate on reclassification." Dorian rose. He wasn't allowed to speak directly during this portion, but Voss turned toward him and gave the briefest of nods, a signal of mutual understanding. Heron leaned back in his chair in the gallery. His arms were crossed, his badge just visible beneath his blazer. He whispered quietly to no one in particular. When safety becomes optional, accountability becomes mandatory. The envelope was plain, sealed with a thin strip of translucent adhesive and slightly worn around the edges, as if handled many times before finally being delivered. Laris Dorn held it tightly in his left hand as he stepped out of the elevator and into the marble-tiled lobby of the tribunal offices. Dorian Merrick stood just inside, reviewing notes on a slim tablet while a young paralegal briefed him on the next session's timing. When Dorian glanced up, his eyes narrowed with curiosity, then recognition. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon," Dorian said, lowering the tablet. Laris offered a tight smile. "Neither did I. But something's not sitting right, and I believe you'll want to see this." Without further word, he handed over the envelope. Dorian opened it carefully. Inside were 2 printed sheets and a compact flash drive. "What is this?" he asked, scanning the timestamp logs. "I used to consult for Sky CivTech," Laris explained, voice low. "They're the ones who developed the internal surveillance systems for NovaSky's newer fleet. After I got off Flight 772 and saw the coverage, I ran a diagnostic cross-check through an old maintenance access node I still had credentials for. Just to see." Dorian's brow furrowed. "And what did you find?" 2 camera feeds, specifically. The front cabin view and seat row 14's side angle were inactive between 1736 and 1746. That's the exact window leading up to the stabbing. Dorian's eyes darkened, his voice barely above a whisper. Missing? Laris nodded solemnly. Either deleted or redirected, but the system shows a manual override request logged during that window, accessed by a steward console. That means someone didn't just let this happen. They tried to make sure we wouldn't see it. For a moment, the world around Dorian seemed to slow. The bustling hallway, the echo of shoes against marble, the faint drone of air conditioning, it all receded into a quiet tension behind his temples. "Veil," he muttered. He stalled when things escalated. He ignored the knife. And now this? Laris's expression was grave. It's more than passive negligence. It's digital concealment. Intentional. Without hesitation, Dorian turned to his paralegal. "Secure the footage logs. Tag this as evidence Tier 1, and inform Judge Voss we need an emergency review now." Minutes later, the tribunal chamber doors opened again, not for court, but for crisis verification. Judge Kieran Voss, sleeves rolled halfway up, leaned over a console with his tech team, flipping through lines of log entries and metadata. The room had dimmed slightly, the overhead lights focused only on the screens. Dorian stood to the side, silent but sharp-eyed, while Laris explained the timestamps and the override trail. One of the digital forensics analysts, a younger man named Trellin Hove, paused mid-scroll. "Here," he said, pointing to a hex-encoded access string. "This matches the steward console serial from Flight 772, and this is a private steward code, not general access. It had to be entered manually. Fingerprint ID attached confirms it was Veil." Judge Voss leaned back slowly in his chair. He toggled the camera stream to temporary pause before the attack. 6 minutes before, Trellin confirmed. It created a blind spot. If Dorian hadn't had his blazer cam running, we would have only had second-hand reports for that entire sequence. Voss turned toward Dorian. "This shifts everything." Dorian's voice was even, but edged with restrained fury. "He didn't just fail to protect my son. He created a digital silence around the danger. He used the system like a curtain." Outside the chamber, news hadn't yet caught wind of the revelation. But inside, the mood shifted palpably. Herren Voss, seated quietly in the observation gallery, leaned forward slightly. He recognized the legal weight of what was unfolding. This wasn't just about crew misconduct. It was now a case of premeditated concealment and abuse of security access. Judge Voss turned to his clerk. "Issue a formal revision of charges. We're expanding this to include digital obstruction under Section F9 of the Passenger Protection Statutes." Laris remained still, watching Dorian closely. "I couldn't walk away from this," he said softly. "I needed to know the system still works." Dorian glanced at him, and for a moment the sternness in his face gave way to something softer. Respect, perhaps even gratitude. "You didn't just help us," Dorian replied. "You made sure this story couldn't be rewritten." The judge nodded toward the press liaison, already drafting an updated briefing. The tribunal had moved from reactive to investigative. Veil's smirk in earlier hearings, his thin excuses and polished uniform, suddenly took on a new light. He had been acting behind the scenes the entire time, hoping that his control of the intercom and cameras would silence the truth. But it hadn't. Not with Dorn's memory. Not with Dorian's vigilance. Not with the right people watching. As the new evidence packet was sealed and submitted into the tribunal's ledger, Judge Voss tapped his gavel once, not in verdict, but in recognition. "He tried to hide the truth before it happened," Dorian told the press, "and in doing so, he exposed a deeper flaw in the system." The attacker smirked, certain no one would expose him, unaware that every angle, every statement, and every lie was being captured in crystal clarity. And the father? Already calling attorneys who specialize in turning arrogance into courtroom destruction. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets evidence, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The audit results came in just after sunrise. Dorian Merrick was seated in a quiet lounge outside Kalen's medical room, his blazer folded beside him, the cuff camera now inactive but still resting like a silent witness. A junior legal associate approached briskly, tablet in hand and worry stitched into his expression. "Sir," he began, lowering his voice, "you'll want to see this." The screen glowed with damning content. An internal NovaSky compliance review, prompted by tribunal request, had uncovered a hidden messaging thread, an unofficial crew group chat titled Turbulence Club. It wasn't on any formal communication network. This one ran through encrypted apps, masking identities until the company's digital forensics team cracked the alias routing. The chat's contents were worse than expected. Flight attendants from multiple regional crews, including Torrin Vale, had been using it to share stories, memes, and comments about problem passengers. But as the pages scrolled, a darker pattern emerged. Thread after thread laced with thinly veiled and occasionally overt discrimination. Young black male passengers were often the subject. Descriptions like entitled, non-compliant, and always acting up when corrected littered the conversations. A post dated 2 weeks prior stood out starkly, an image of a black teenager reading a book, captioned, "Bet he'll start trouble over a juice cup." Vale had responded beneath it, "If they lean back into my space, they'll meet policy head-on." The final blow? Preston Harlon's name. Dorian leaned forward, scanning the screen with icy focus as the associate explained. Preston had somehow been added to the group chat. Not crew, not staff, just there. The audit logs showed his access granted 13 days before Flight 772. His phone number was logged in metadata from a backup archive. The only question that remained was how. The answer arrived in the next file. A photo from a company-hosted donor event, Vale and Preston standing shoulder to shoulder, laughing over champagne flutes. A brief note below it. Shared by a former steward, source verified. When tribunal officers questioned Vale later that morning, he admitted, after hesitation, that they had kept in touch through a few mutual friends. He had invited Preston into the chat, claiming it was mostly jokes. To Dorian, the implication was no longer circumstantial. It was structural. He filed a supplemental complaint with Tribunal Judge Kieran Voss before the hour ended. The updated complaint shifted the framework of the case. No longer was this simply negligence or delayed response. It was now classified under coordinated negligence and discriminatory bias, a legal configuration with broader implications for federal review and civil penalty. Meanwhile, in the soft blue halls of Halvin Ridge Medical, Kalen sat upright for the first time since the incident. His ribs, still sore, were secured beneath gauze and padding. A quiet beep from the heart monitor pulsed beside him. A journalist from a civil rights media network sat nearby, careful not to crowd the boy. "I understand if you don't want to talk much," the reporter said, "but the country's watching. Is there anything you want them to know?" Kalen didn't look up at first. He was holding his tablet again, not reading this time, just staring at the screen where his unfinished physics chapter had frozen mid-scroll during the flight. He finally lifted his gaze and met the man's eyes. "I didn't want to cause trouble," he said quietly. "I just wanted to finish my chapter." He paused, his voice clear but laced with something deeper, disappointment, awareness, strength earned too soon. "But now I know. Sometimes silence is what gives danger a seat right behind you." The room stayed still. The reporter blinked, then pressed the stop button on the recorder without a word. That single quote would headline national articles within 24 hours. In NovaSky's headquarters, however, a different kind of silence reigned. The CEO, a middle-aged executive named Garen Trask, issued a formal apology that morning through a pre-recorded press statement. The words were polished, approved by legal, and ultimately empty. "We deeply regret the events that occurred aboard Flight 772, he said. Our thoughts are with the Merrick family. We are reviewing internal policy and reaffirm our commitment to safety and dignity for all passengers." There was no mention of the chat logs, no mention of Preston, no accountability beyond the usual placeholder words. Dorian received a call from Trask's assistant offering a direct line to the executive. He declined. "We're not interested in symbolic calls," he said simply. Then he turned toward the team in the briefing room and outlined the next step: public testimony. Not behind closed doors, but in full view. If a passenger's body could be pierced mid-air without protection, then the system protecting them would need to be rebuilt from the inside out. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window as another associate pinned Kalen's quote onto a digital campaign board already building momentum online. The quote sat centered, framed by bold text above, "We can't trust a seatbelt to guard against silence." Dorian read it once, nodded, then stood. "We're not settling," he said, eyes fixed ahead. "We're setting a new flight path for every child who deserves safety." Preston Harlon's legal team made their move early the next morning. A sharply dressed man in a navy suit, eyes concealed behind dark glasses, arrived at the hospital with a thick envelope and a cautious smile. He introduced himself to Dorian Merrick as a neutral representative and requested a brief, private meeting. Dorian agreed, barely looking up from his chair beside Kalen's hospital bed. The man slid the envelope forward on the small conference table. "A private settlement," he said smoothly. "Substantial, confidential, no admission of wrongdoing." His voice was rehearsed as if this was routine, just another page in a long playbook. Dorian didn't even open the envelope. "This isn't about money," he said evenly, his hands calmly folded on the table. "It's about precedent." The legal envoy nodded, then made a note in his pad, masking his frustration with professional detachment. "Then I'll inform counsel that the offer was declined." But what followed in the next few hours proved the case was never just about Preston. A deeper thread began to unravel. In the central office of NovaSky Aviation, Head of Operations Marlene Dross was reviewing archived employee records when he paused over an internal performance evaluation file for Torrin Vale. What he found was unsettling. 3 separate reports within the last 12 months flagged Vale for selective enforcement, unresponsive behavior during minor disturbances, and disregard of escalation protocol involving youth passengers. Yet, 2 months ago, Vale had been promoted to route overseer, a supervisory position over other attendants. Dross scrolled to the bottom of the file. The signature on the promotion approval read simply, R.H. The initials matched Royce Harlon, Preston's cousin, an executive board member, and, until now, a name far from the tribunal spotlight. Dross hesitated, then forwarded the memo to the tribunal under protected whistleblower status. That document landed on Judge Kieran Voss's desk just before the next hearing session. The courtroom buzzed as the judge raised his eyes from the paper. "This changes the scope," he announced. "We are no longer evaluating isolated misconduct. We are now investigating the possibility of administrative collusion and abuse of internal power structures." The tension inside the tribunal room thickened like fog. Dorian, seated beside his co-counsel, leaned slightly forward as if sensing the ground had shifted beneath them, not with chaos, but with clarity. Kalen was still recovering 2 floors above, his wound cleaned, his breathing steadier, but the scars of betrayal lingered in Dorian's chest. He whispered to himself, this wasn't just an attack. It was permission granted in layers. Later that evening, back in the dimly lit hospital room, Dorian sat quietly at Kalen's bedside. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor kept steady time with the thoughts racing through his mind. Kalen had drifted into a light sleep, but stirred when Dorian adjusted his blanket. "I met a man today who wanted this to disappear," Dorian said softly, more to himself than to his son. Kalen opened one eye, blinking slowly. "Disappear?" he asked groggily. "A check, a silence fee." Dorian offered a faint smile, but his eyes held fire. We said no. Kalen stared at the ceiling. Good. Dorian hesitated, then spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. There's more. Vale was promoted by someone tied to Preston, his cousin, Royce Harlon, an executive. Kalen turned his head slowly toward his father. They're all connected. They thought they'd never get caught, that no one would connect the dots. Dorian placed a steady hand over Kalen's. But you did, just by sitting down and not moving. Kalen's brow furrowed. I didn't do anything. You changed more than your seat, son, Dorian said, leaning in. You changed where this plane is heading, for every kid who ever felt boxed in. Kalen let the words linger for a moment. Then, through the ache in his ribs and the exhaustion in his limbs, he managed a faint, tired smile. Let's make sure they land safely next time. Judge Kieran Voss's gavel struck once, sharply, echoing across the tribunal chamber. Mr. Royce Harlon, you were ordered to appear. Please step forward. The atmosphere was taut. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Journalists, legal interns, off-duty pilots, and civilian spectators sat in rigid silence. Royce entered with a crisp suit and a controlled smirk, his footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor. He walked like a man expecting a formality, confident, detached, and entirely unaware that the room had already shifted beneath him. He took the stand with the calm of someone used to being in charge. But across the aisle, Dorian Merrick watched him closely. Eyes narrowed. His legal team sat with their tablets in front of them, one finger resting on a digital timeline loaded with damning evidence. Dorian had anticipated this moment. Not just the man, but the mindset. Royce Harlon represented the systemic altitude at which arrogance and silence flew side by side. Mr. Harlon, began Judge Voss, steely-voiced, you've stated previously that your involvement with crew management decisions was minimal, that you, quote, trusted the disciplinary process already in place. He leaned forward. Can you explain, then, why you personally overrode 3 crew suspension recommendations for Mr. Torrin Vale, each one filed within 48 hours of receiving sizable donations from passengers under formal review? There was a visible shift in the room. The air seemed to press inward. Royce's smirk faltered, if only briefly. I don't recall specific timelines, he said with a smooth exhale. But those donations had no bearing on personnel decisions. We have a firewall between contributions and crew evaluations. Do you? Dorian stood. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried power. He walked toward the display monitor beside the judge's bench. Let's test that firewall. He tapped a remote and a timeline filled the screen. Date stamps, emails, memo excerpts, and donation receipts flashed across, color-coded and unmistakable. March 4th, Dorian narrated, Vale receives his first formal citation from a passenger flagged for bias. He clicked again. March 5th, a donation from Preston Harlon, your cousin, arrives. March 6th, Vale's citation is voided. Same pattern repeats in May, and again in July. He paused. Same steward, same donor, same override signature. Yours. Royce's face tightened. Correlation doesn't prove causation. Those decisions were evaluated independently. Not anymore, Judge Voss replied coldly. I'm issuing a subpoena for NovaSky's entire HR archive for the past 18 months. Full records, email chains, donation logs, internal memos. He banged the gavel once. Effective immediately. Royce's hand clenched on the railing. Dorian returned to his seat, but his eyes never left the executive's face. He could see it now, the twitch of fear that always comes when control begins to leak like fuel from a fractured engine. Meanwhile, behind the closed tribunal doors in a smaller adjoining chamber, Kalen Merrick sat quietly at a polished wooden table. A legal advisor explained the nature of closed-door testimonies, but Kalen barely needed it. His posture was composed. His hands rested flat. His wound had healed physically, but the scar of betrayal lingered. "When you're ready, Kalen," the panelist said gently. Kalen nodded. "He didn't just stab me with a knife," he said slowly, every word deliberate. "He stabbed through the idea that rules were protecting me." His eyes didn't waver. "I was sitting in my assigned seat. I wasn't being loud. I wasn't causing trouble. I was just reading." And the crew laughed with him. Not once, multiple times. That's what hurts more than the cut. In the main chamber, a reporter turned to his colleague and whispered, just loud enough to be caught on the courtroom mic, "This isn't just a trial. It's the black box opening midair." "Run the override sequence again," one of the tribunal analysts muttered, eyes fixed on the stream logs from Flight 772. The room was silent except for the low hum of servers and the occasional tap of a key. The footage flickered across a wide wall screen in the Halvin Ridge Tribunal Center, showing Kalen Merrick tapping his alert button shortly after the initial seat shove, only for the signal to vanish in the system logs moments later. Not acknowledged, not routed, just gone. Outside, reporters gathered in clusters beneath a gray sky, microphones poised like spears. Protesters formed a widening ring around the courthouse steps, holding signs with phrases scrawled in thick black paint, "Let kids recline." Safety has no class section. Every seat matters. The air buzzed with growing unrest. Inside the tribunal chamber, Judge Kieran Vos stood at the podium, arms crossed, watching as the technical team completed their final validation. He had ordered the analysis after something in Kalen's original seat footage didn't align, something too quiet, too edited. And now the answer was blaring in silence. The steward console had been used not just to pause cameras but to suppress emergency signals. This, the lead analyst said, turning from his station, was not a glitch. The console logs show a deliberate override using steward key code 7XR9. That code belongs to Torrin Vale. The gallery murmured like wind through dry leaves. Dorian Merrick's eyes narrowed, jaw tight. Beside him, his co-counsel handed him a fresh packet, witness statements, diagrams of the console, and expert validation on the override's timing. He didn't need to read it again. He already knew what it meant. Preston had stabbed his son. That was the spark. But the flame had been fanned long before. In the back row, Herren Voss folded his arms and leaned forward. He had served alongside Vale in an ethics workshop 4 years prior. Even then, Vale had bristled at phrases like unbiased de-escalation and preemptive restraint review. Herren remembered his smirk, the kind of smile that always curled away just before a rule got bent. Now, his brother Kieran addressed the room. "Let the record show," he began, his voice steady but rising, "that we are no longer evaluating just a single act of violence. We are evaluating a chain of silent decisions that transformed a passenger's plea for help into a void." He gestured to the footage. When the alert was triggered by Mr. Kalen Merrick, protocol demands that it be routed to both the senior crew member and cockpit. That signal was erased. That silence was designed. Preston's legal team fidgeted. The lead attorney, a gray-suited man named Varen Klell, leaned toward Royce Harlan's empty seat, now vacated by board order. They were losing footing, and fast. Dorian stood slowly. "I'd like to submit an addendum," he said, placing a new document on the exhibit table. "A statement from the development team that installed NovaSky's feedback interface. It confirms that the override log was manually activated within 6 seconds of my son pressing the button." He paused, scanning the chamber. No child should press that button and be met with silence. There it was, his voice calm, but edged with something firmer than outrage. Resolve. The silence in the chamber deepened. The press outside shifted their camera lenses toward the windows as word spread that a major development was underway. Judge Voss looked over the tribunal panel and then turned back to the room. "In light of these revelations," he said slowly, I will now initiate a formal vote among my fellow justices to recommend permanent regulation upgrades for crew conduct standards. If passed, these regulations will apply not just to NovaSky, but to all regional carriers. Someone in the gallery whispered, "It's happening," as the panelists tapped their devices. A moment passed, then another. The vote results appeared on the courtroom display, green bars rising across all 7 justices. Unanimous. Voss took a breath, then raised his voice for the stenographer. The tribunal hereby recommends mandatory implementation of tamper-resistant alert systems, cross-synced with passenger footage, and an updated crew training protocol on escalation, conduct ethics, and surveillance accountability. These measures shall be enforceable across all certified regional airlines. Reporters outside were already transmitting the update. Dorian's legal assistant received a buzz. 5 news outlets had picked up the story in under 2 minutes. Judge Voss wasn't done. He turned back to the screen showing the frozen frame of Vale laughing during Preston's earlier muttered insults. "Let it be known," he said, "that the knife was not the only weapon aboard that plane. Negligence is quiet until someone proves it has a voice. And silence, intentional, engineered silence, is not innocence, it is consent." In the gallery, a middle-aged father who had flown with his disabled son just last month wiped his eyes. Dorian remained standing, his face unreadable. It had been a long journey since seat 14A. Later, a reporter asked him what message he hoped this hearing sent. Dorian simply said, "This is not just about Kalen. This is about every passenger who's been told they're too loud, too much, or too different to sit in peace." And in the chamber, Judge Voss delivered the line that would define the reform effort and headline news segments for weeks to come. "Truth must not depend on who has the intercom," he said. "It must speak even in turbulence." The verdict came down hard and fast on the 7th day of tribunal hearings, but there was no ceremonial build-up, just the firm, unwavering voice of Judge Kieran Voss delivering each decision with surgical precision. Preston Harlon, guilty of aggravated in-flight assault under Civil Aviation Code 12.4a, sentenced to mandatory federal confinement, no parole, no early release. A sharp intake of breath cut through the chamber. Preston's face, once full of smug dismissal, had crumpled. His hands twitched slightly, restrained by soft cuffs that now felt like iron bands. 2 officers stepped forward to escort him away, but he didn't move immediately. His eyes searched the room, perhaps for sympathy, perhaps for a loophole, but found only a wall of quiet justice watching him go. In the gallery, Kalen Merrick's expression didn't change. His eyes remained steady on the man who had stabbed his son without hesitation. Not out of anger, but as if Kalen had been an inconvenience. Now that man was being removed, not by rage, but by the law. Then came the next name. Torrin Vale, found in breach of federal aviation protocol and obstruction of passenger alert systems. All crew certifications are hereby revoked, effective immediately. You are now under formal federal investigation. Vale didn't speak. He didn't protest. He simply sank further into his chair as the tribunal officers approached. His mouth opened slightly as if a word might come, but none did. There was no justification for the silence he'd weaponized during that flight. None for the alert override, none for the laughter. Judge Voss didn't even pause before the 3rd ruling. Royce Harlan, found complicit in suppressing crew conduct violations and interfering with internal disciplinary procedures, suspended from all board responsibilities indefinitely, pending criminal review. Royce, who had tried to enter this courtroom like a man untouchable, now sat hunched behind his legal team, his confidence leaking away with every passing second. A folder of emails on the evidence screen, time-stamped and damning, glowed behind him like a permanent scar, but it was the next act that silenced the room entirely. Effective immediately, I am drafting the Merrick Amendment. He stood, pulling a thick document from his bench drawer, signing it with a black fountain pen. The room watched the ink bleed into the page, each stroke final. This amendment requires all future aircraft to be equipped with tamper-proof passenger alert logs and all in-flight crew interactions to be subject to de-escalation recording systems. Any manipulation or obstruction of these systems will now constitute a federal violation. There were no cheers, just a collective exhale, a tension that had built across days finally settling. Dorian closed his eyes briefly. He had not come to this tribunal to punish. He had come to ensure it never happened again. Back home, Kalen had returned to his quiet room, bandages still tight around his ribs. A sterile white desk lamp cast a soft glow as he booted up his laptop. The digital classroom portal opened with the familiar chime, and the names of his classmates began to populate the sidebar. A small notification appeared from his teacher. "Welcome back, Kalen. Would you like to share something with the class today?" He hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. A dozen thoughts moved through his mind, memories of the recline, the pain, the blood, his father's steady voice, the cold courtroom chairs. He could have said anything, but instead he clicked "No" and closed the message quietly. He opened the school board form and typed something else instead. It wasn't long, just one sentence, but it held everything. If someone tries to silence your safety, remember, there's always a way to record the truth. Part 13. Expanded. Months had passed since the tribunal ruling, but the echoes of what happened aboard NovaSky Flight 772 had not faded. Instead, they spread through terminals, conference rooms, cockpit seminars, and safety briefings across the country. A quiet but forceful wave of reform moved beneath the surface, rippling from every affidavit, every second of cuff footage, every headline that carried Kalen Merrick's name. The moment the reclined directive was enacted, its presence was felt, not as a slogan, but as policy inked into training manuals, staff simulations, and aircraft control systems. New hire orientations now included emotional cue detection, bias escalation patterns, and silent signal override prevention. Internal crew communication was monitored for discrimination. And, most importantly, passengers' safety alerts were no longer routed through a single console. They were automatically logged to a cloud-encrypted system accessible to oversight regulators. Every push of a help button had a permanent voice now. At the heart of this national shift, people began asking who would lead the initiative. Dorian Merrick's name surfaced immediately. To many, he was the obvious choice, calm under pressure, surgical in his legal precision, and respected across industries. But when the advisory board extended the invitation, his response was measured and brief. "I appreciate the honor," he said, standing beside his son during a live announcement at Halvin Ridge Terminal. "But we already did our part. Now they need to prove they've learned." There was silence, then applause. Dorian's refusal wasn't arrogance, it was conviction. He believed true reform couldn't be shaped by those who had already suffered its necessity. It had to come from those now holding the blueprint, with the courage to implement it without needing another tragedy. Kalen stood beside his father, taller now, his posture upright but never boastful. The compression wraps were gone, replaced with a navy blazer and a silver pin, a gift from the Civil Resilience Committee. That evening, in a packed auditorium with polished oak walls and hundreds of folding seats, Kalen Merrick became the youngest recipient in 2 decades to receive the National Civil Resilience Award. He was called to the podium by Judge Kieran Voss himself. The same man who had slammed the gavel down during Preston Harlon's sentencing now handed the teen a plaque, nodding once before stepping aside. Kalen approached the microphone slowly. Cameras clicked. A few audience members leaned forward expecting a grand speech, but Kalen only glanced once at the plaque, then at his father. "All I wanted," he said, voice steady, "was to finish my book." He paused. The room hushed. What I got instead was a chapter no one should ever have to write. His gaze didn't waver. But I'm glad we wrote it right. There were no notes, no rehearsed phrases, just those simple lines. When he stepped down, even the reporters remained still for a moment before writing. Later that month, NovaSky quietly retired the original Flight 772 aircraft. It had become a symbol of something too heavy, too publicly bruised to remain in circulation. A new aircraft was commissioned in its place, identical in structure, upgraded in function, redesigned with every clause of the reclined directive embedded into its tech core. One feature, however, stood apart. At seat 14A, the original seat number Kalen had occupied, engineers installed a small bronze plaque. It wasn't glossy or extravagant, just a solid, intentional mark. The crew installed it during a midnight hangar rotation, under strict instructions not to alter the surrounding seat structure, so that the imprint would remain authentic, untouched, real. Passengers who later sat there said they often paused before reclining. The plaque read, "Every child deserves to sit without fear. Every father deserves to stand without begging. And every story deserves to be recorded before it's rewritten." By landing, the footage was secured, the legal team activated, and the attacker's fate sealed tighter than any restraint. The courtroom flipped instantly. The recliner fight became a national case, and the father's calm precision dismantled every excuse. If you believe real authority strikes with preparation, power, and decisive justice, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, abuse of power, and the importance of evidence and accountability in confronting injustice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and protecting the vulnerable.